Inflation goes up and inflation goes down, but when we're in a period where inflation is higher than we're used to, like it's been over the past couple of years, everyone gets pretty grumpy about how expensive life is. Inflation has a direct impact on how people are able to get by, and it especially hits society's poorest the hardest. How did we get where we are? What causes inflation to go up, and what can governments do to bring it back down? In this video, we're going to look at the answers to those questions. It's actually pretty simple to understand how we got here, but not quite as simple to figure out how we tame inflation. By the end, you'll be motivated to subscribe to this channel. It's always fun to blame someone when things aren't as rosy as we'd like to think. When we think about inflation, it has to be someone's fault, right? Is it this guy? Is it this guy? How about her? But if you go beyond just trying to blame someone and instead look at the root causes of inflation, then you get a better picture of what's going on. If so many other countries have the same problem with inflation, it must not be because of one single dude, right? At its most basic definition, inflation is the price of things going up. Why does this happen? Too much money trying to buy too few goods. Let's focus on the current situation in Canada and other developed countries to get at why. Early in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic was kicking the crap out of us, governments were scrambling trying to figure out how to help citizens protect themselves and at the same time keep the economy from collapsing. The Canadian government did the logical, rational thing, the same thing that governments in the US and Europe did. They started injecting cash into the economy by making money available to individuals and businesses. Some of this money was a societal gift to help people who were losing income because they weren't working, like the CERB program. There were cheap and easy loans for small businesses to help them stay running. The federal government in Canada spent just over $352 billion on pandemic response over 3 years, with almost $283 billion going to fiscal supports for individuals and businesses. There was an Auditor General's report in December of 2022 that took a pretty critical look at all that. Sure, they could have instead said, wow, that's a lot of money and we can't afford it. Let's not be as helpful. But that would essentially be saying to Canadians that their government doesn't care about them. And most of us did our part as much as we were able. We supported small businesses, we ordered takeout from restaurants, we got COVID vaccinations, and we generally followed the guidance that was put out at the time, except for these idiots, of course. The Bank of Canada lowered interest rates, and the banks that we all use every day followed suit, making it easier to borrow money. When interest rates are low, and they were super low during the pandemic, then more people are in a position where they can take out loans to buy bigger things like houses. When society is being encouraged to spend, and it's easier to do that because of the availability of easier money, then people who are able to will spend. And there was something else going on at the same time. All around the world, wherever there were factories making the stuff we all wanted, they were impacted by the pandemic too. They couldn't get the raw materials they needed. Their output was lower because their workers were either sick or unable to do their jobs. They couldn't get the finished products to the people who wanted to buy them. This resulted in lower supply of pretty much everything. When you have a lot of people wanting things that are being sold, but not enough of those things to meet that increased demand, prices go up. That's inflation. So what caused inflation in Canada? The availability of money, people who wanted to spend it, and not enough stuff to spend it on. I know, we probably could have done things differently, right? You may be thinking that despite all of the external factors outside of our control, and despite the fact that so many countries around the world were experiencing the same inflation because of the same causes, that it's still the fault of the Canadian government for high inflation. Or maybe you accept that the causes of inflation weren't exactly in the government's control, but the solutions are. Well, let's look at those solutions. Really, it's the reverse of the things we talked about being the causes of inflation. Could the Canadian government have spent less? Sure could have. That likely would have meant that more Canadians would be in a worse financial position right now, but sure. During a global pandemic with thousands of people dying and everyone doing their best to help, except these idiots, they could have spent less. Could the Canadian government exert its supreme control over the price of goods and the raw materials that stuff is made from around the world? Could the Canadian government lower housing prices? Not really, a bit maybe. High housing prices are not unique to Canada by any means, but the federal government is doing what they can to help with this through a number of ways, like providing money to encourage new housing construction, even though housing is a provincial responsibility. What can the federal government do? They can scale back on the availability of easier money for one thing, and they've done this. The CERB program and other financial support programs ended a long time ago. COVID loans for small businesses are coming due now after a couple of extensions of the deadline. And how about interest rates? Well, the federal government actually doesn't have control over that. The Bank of Canada does. I should have mentioned this earlier, that the Bank of Canada isn't run by the Prime Minister. It's part of the overall apparatus of government, but it's not like the finance minister can call up Tiff Macklin and tell him what to do with interest rates. The Bank of Canada makes those decisions, and rates are adjusted to try to bring inflation into a tightly controlled zone around 2%. When there was easy money flowing to keep the economy moving, the Bank of Canada lowered interest rates to help stimulate borrowing and spending. When inflation rose, the Bank of Canada started doing the reverse. They've been slowly raising rates to discourage spending, and in the process, inflation is coming down. Could the bank do a better job with this tinkering of interest rates? Yeah, probably. Had the bank started raising interest rates sooner, maybe inflation would be even lower. That's the problem with a tool like interest rates. It's not instantaneous. It actually can take about a year and a half to see the impact. So, with inflation coming down, that means prices will return to their pre-pandemic levels, right? Well, maybe not. People can be greedy sometimes, so we're likely to find that as inflationary pressures ease, prices of the things that we want don't quite come down as far as we'd like. There's lots of reasons for that, one of those being corporate profits. Companies will try and keep prices as high as they can so long as people keep paying them, even when their own production costs do come down. The idea of passing savings along to your customers isn't something that every business does. Well, how about taxes? When inflation is high, your money buys you less. It's not worth as much as when inflation is low. So there's an argument that maybe we should look at indexing taxation rates to inflation, having the rates automatically be adjusted based on what's happening with inflation. There was an article by the C.D. Howe Institute that looked into this in August 2023. Maybe that's an idea worth exploring, realizing that it doesn't just mean tax rates always go down. They need to rise again when inflation is reduced. Otherwise, the government won't be able to fund the things society needs. And you know I can't do a video without mentioning the carbon tax. The Bank of Canada looked at the impact of the carbon tax specifically as it contributes to inflation. The haters of the carbon tax won't like this, but the impact of the carbon tax on inflation is teeny tiny. 0.015% of inflation can be attributed to the carbon tax. Whoop-de-doo. Keep the carbon tax where it is. Climate change is probably a bigger contributor to inflation on things like food costs than the carbon tax is anyway. So, where are we now that we've reached the end of this video? Inflation has a lot of causes, most of which are outside of the control of the government. Changing the interest rate is probably one of the most powerful tools to fight inflation, but it takes a long time to get results. And neither the current government nor any opposition politician can snap their fingers and take care of inflation lickety-split. It doesn't work that way, no matter who's in power.